Welcome, everyone. The presentation is about to begin. This session will be recorded and will last 60 minutes. Please keep your mic muted during the presentation and turn off your web cameras. If you have a question or a comment, please enter it in the chat during the presentation, and the presenter will address your questions at the end. If you're on the phone, you will be given the opportunity during the Q&A time to voice your questions or comments. And all participants in today's event will have access to the recorded version, which will be available within 1 to 2 weeks after the live event. So TESOL's International Association's Higher Education Interest section is pleased to present this webinar titled Fostering Inclusivity and Challenging Norms in the Language Classroom. Our speaker today is Dr. James Coda, who is a assistant professor of ESL and World Language Education at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. We are very pleased to welcome all of you to this webinar. My name is Melissa Farrow, and I will be your moderator for today's event. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, James Coda.
Hey, Melissa, thank you for that wonderful introduction, and I'm glad to be here with you all today. If you hear any construction noise outside or in the background, rather, that's from the construction that's going on in the back of my house right now. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and let's go ahead, excuse me, and let's go ahead and begin. So again, my name is James Coda, and the title of my talk today is Fostering Inclusivity and Challenging Norms in the Language Classroom. And so to begin, I would like to discuss the outline of this talk. So first of all, I'm going to start with a little bit of information about the context in which I reside. After, I will talk about the role of norms, so how norms structure our more than social world. Then I will discuss LGBTQIA plus issues in language education, followed by queer theory and pedagogies, as well as how that work has been taken up within language education. Then I will discuss a few research studies that I have conducted related to challenges to heteronormativity or cis-heteronormativity, as well as surrounding teachers' identities and what they have done in the classroom to upend cis-heteronormativity. After that, I will provide a few strategies for increasing inclusion in the classroom. Then I will discuss what a queerer world or what a queerer classroom may look like. And then finally, I will conclude with allyship I will conclude with allyship. And so let's go ahead and begin. So I'm going to give you about 30 seconds, 45 seconds to use your phone to access a little document that I have prepared that has some definitions of some different terms that I may be referring to throughout this presentation. So I will give you about 30 seconds to access that, and then I will go ahead and begin. All right. So if anyone else needs that, please send a message in the chat and I can get that to you. Okay, so I wanted to first of all start off with a quote from a participant in a recent study that I conducted with Kelly Moser and Elaine Wee at Mississippi State University. And we were looking at ESOL and world language educators in the rural southeastern US. And so what I draw your attention here to in this quote from a participant, and this participant's pseudonym is Brian. So what I draw your attention to is how in this quote from Brian, and Brian, just to provide some background, he's a teacher in a conservative and cis-heteronormative context of the southeastern US in a rural space as well. And so he says here, teachers have been told to remove their pronouns from their email signatures. That is a no-go. You will not be putting that. Even if I am he, him, they're saying no, those cannot go in your email signature. You can't talk about it. And I've like kind of pushed back because we were told per district policy. And again, I begin with this quote to draw your attention to the context that I currently reside in, which is Tennessee. And so with the recent ascendance or rise in parental rights bills, as well as in my own context in Tennessee in 2022, there was the divisive concepts bills. So these types of bills in K through 12, as well as, for example, the divisive concepts affects me, as well as any other professor within the University of Tennessee. Again, this limits what can be discussed in our classroom. So we have to always be cognizant of what we are saying, how we are saying it, because it could potentially be perceived as a divisive concept. And so, for example, in bringing this to Tennessee too, we have SB 90, the Divisive Concepts Bill. And just to give you a little bit of background, and I'm not going to tell you all of what it states about what divisive concepts are, but divisive concepts, according to this law, SB 90, state, for example, that one race or sex is inherently, you cannot say, or a professor, a university educator, excuse me, cannot say that one race or sex is inherently superior or inferior to another race or sex. Another tenet of this bill is that you cannot say, for example, or imply that an individual, by virtue of the individual's race or sex, is inherently privileged, racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or subconsciously. And this list again goes on and on with the tenets of this bill. And so while I do concur with Shelton 2018, she stated that the southeastern US is not a monolithic region. I do want to emphasize, however, that these parental rights bills, as well as these divisive concepts, the divisive concepts bill here in Tennessee, again, they can limit what we can do in K through 12 and higher educational contexts. And so most of my research, everyone, has centered on the southeastern US because and related to challenges to cis heteronormativity. And so again, within this context that I work in, I'm interested in how we can subvert the cis heteronormative status quo. So the cis heteronormative status quo is a norm, right? And so a norm is something that is, for example, they structure our lives. We have many norms that operate in our more than social world. And the one key aspect of a discussion in and around norms is that norms create a dichotomy of, for example, one group or one individuals are on the left side of the binary, and the others are on the right side, or the relegated to the wrong side of the binary. And therefore, this is exclusionary because they're relegated to the wrong side of the binary. Now, Maschenbacher and Stegu in 2013 talked about the way in which gender, sex, and sexuality are connected is influenced by hegemonic norms, okay, which dictate that proper human beings, whatever that is, are either women or men, that proper women and men are heterosexual, and that people articulating other identities and desires are deviant. So this relates to what I was just saying about the binary being relegated to the wrong side of the binary and how that causes exclusion. And again, considering the role of norms and related to gender and sexuality, it is essential that we ask questions such as, for example, what Trend 2020 asked: what would I do differently to teach my students to think critically, to challenge the norms? So in our classrooms, we have students of many backgrounds, and we must be cognizant of how these norms are operating within our classrooms, within our own discourse, within our students' discourse, so that we do not perpetuate historical inequalities and cause exclusion for our students and beyond. And so now moving along, thinking about language education and LGBTQIA plus issues in language education. Since the 1990s, there has been increased, for example, attention to the centrality of identity but even with this turn towards the social or the critical turn, language education is unfortunately still largely cis heteronormative, and it upholds the cis heteronormative status quo. And for example, Nelson in 2009 described the paucity or limited attention to LGBTQIA plus issues and experiences in language education. And so thinking about cis heteronormativity, it is not just in our, for example, research. It is not imbued not only within our research endeavors or, for example, our practices, but it is also within the textbooks. The materials themselves are largely cis heteronormative. However, with this ubiquitous nature of cis heteronormativity, again, it's essential that we cultivate classrooms in which all students' identities are valued and cis heteronormativity is challenged. And so, for example, here in a study of adult English language educators' perceptions of LGBTQIA plus issues, Rhodes and Coda in 2017 described how, for example, attending to spontaneous discussions and employing the tenets of deconstruction from queer theory and pedagogies can be a way to challenge that cis heteronormative status quo. And so now moving along to thinking about Rhodes and Coda's study. However, in this study too, some teachers discussed how they did not feel that LGBTQIA plus issues were relevant to the classroom. And this coincides with what I have here from Anya and Randolph in 2019, which states how we must openly address race and racism in language education policies, instructional practices, and curriculum, regardless of the arguments that some make alleging that such discussions court controversy or are political, and thus have no place in language education. So again, the language classroom should be a context in which race, racism, gender, sexuality, cis heteronormativity, ability, disability, and beyond are discussed, and those norms are challenged. But while research has underscored the necessity of attending to such issues, Niesley and HEIS in 2021 described how access, equity, and representation are still paramount. And these are aspects that we still need to work on within the field. So now let's move along to queer theory and pedagogies. And so in queer theory and pedagogies, or queer theory to begin, it comes out of feminism and post-structuralism, and it resists labels and categories. It asks us to upend our normal practices and our assumptions. And so queer theory is emblematically resistant to the notion of a fixed or innate identity, and it resists modernist notions of the humanistic conception of the self, so that I, and so forth. And so thinking about this, considering this resistance to normative categories, queer theories, for example, in 2008, Armstrong 2008 described how a queer pedagogy of conflicted practice, which is both anti-identity, but also identity affirming, right? And so again, these types of perspectives, they developed out of this post-structuralist conceptions of identity as multiple and unstable. So again, gender and sexuality are not considered to be some part of some stable core, but they are considered to be multiple. They are considered to be performative and produced in and through discourses. And so in considering all of this, we need to also be aware of our reading practices. So not just looking at text, but also our reading of the more than social world. And so continuing along with queer theory and pedagogies, I want to also mention how queer is, according to Buchholz and Hall in 2004, it does not just solely focus on LGBTQIA plus individuals, but all individuals who have been excluded related to cis heteronormativity. And so Nelson's 1999 article here was really the kind of seminal article that invited us to think more queerly within language education. And so she described in this article how a gay and lesbian approach, in contrast to queer inquiry thinking, aims to include authentic images of gays and lesbians. But we also must be aware of our representational practices. Again, we do not want to continue to uphold norms, and we don't want to just solely represent white upper class gay men in our classroom. For example, if we're doing a family, so we need to be thinking about the norms. We need to be thinking about how we can include individuals from all backgrounds within our classrooms. So considering what I was just saying around, for example, queer theory, the notion of identities is multiple, unstable, I include this quote from Common Taylor et al. 2022 in TESOL Quarterly, which described how queering the language classroom goes far beyond anything having to do with sex per se, toward understandings that cast all identities, linguistic, cultural, sexual, racial, ability, disability, as fluid, emergent, and subject to discursive maintenance and change. So therefore, again, queering the classroom invites us to consider how identities, languages, and everything in our more than social world is not fixed. There is no stasis, but always becoming. And finally, around queer theory and pedagogies, thinking about how it can be accomplished in language education. And specifically, I draw on Curran's work from 2006 here, considering, for example, contexts like similar to mine, in which one may not be able to speak of issues of gender and sexuality in the classroom. So here, Curran talks about how, according to inviting queer inquiry into the classroom, you can do this by reframing mainstream questions about the topic of homosexuality in ways that get beyond the notion of teacher as expert and engage students in rethinking their questions and deconstructing sexual norms. So in this approach from Curran, and this again makes me think of the context in which I am employed and reside, and similar contexts too in which these parental rights bills have surfaced. Again, how can we as educators consider our questions and how binaries are surfacing, for example, not in only just the students' questions, but the student statements, our own statements, and how we can upend those norms. Thinking about our questioning practices specifically, we need to bring that critical perspective. And by inviting queer inquiry into the classroom, we can do this, especially in context, I argue, in context similar to mine, in which one may not be able to engage with issues of gender and sexual diversity. So now I'm going to describe a few studies that I have conducted with my other co-authors. And so I'm just going to describe, first of all, I'm going to show an illustrative example from one of my studies regarding teaching proficiency through reading and storytelling. And so just a little bit of background about this method. It emphasizes quality teacher input before the production of output. And it really just relies on comprehensible input, personalized questions and answers, and co-created stories. But what I find to be very productive out of TPRS is how it can be a way to to create different stories to trouble the content of the classroom. So to get us to for example, as I will show you later or in a second, to get us to have different endings to stories in which, for example, two maybe cisgender males can be lovers. And so I'm going to show you an excerpt from this study. And in this first excerpt is from an adult Spanish language classroom. And so in this Spanish language classroom, at the beginning of this, at the beginning of our observations of this classroom, there was a sign that said, todo es posible en la clase de español, and which means everything is possible or anything is possible in Spanish class. And so this sign, again, provided a space to say, hey, in our classroom, we're open. The teacher right here was providing a space by saying, hey, anything's possible in this class. Anything can become within this class. And so in particular here, starting with this classroom, for example, the teacher started out by asking if there were princesses. Again, these co-created stories between the students and the teacher. And so the teacher was asking, are there any princesses, as we see here in the first few lines? But as we get down here in line 7, the teacher says, is Sean a princess? Sean es princesa? So she was asking, is Sean a princess? Is this possible? One student says no, and there was some laughter, right? And we could interpret this as, hey, this is, their students are maybe finding this to be humorous that a cisgender male could be a princess. And so we have the student right here refuting that. No, he's not a princess. But as we go along, what happens in this classroom moment is this right here. Sean says in line 9, I think, which is an error. It should be yo pienso, I think, rather than yo piensa, which is the third person singular. And so he goes along here. And as we see here, again, the negotiation between the teacher and the student. But in line 13, Sean says, I think I'm a princess. Again, the error that we see here grammatically. And then the teacher repeats what Sean says to correct that error. But again, we see students, for example, in line 17 saying, oh, Prince, you mean? Prince? But as we go along, we see in line 19, it's possible. And as we see here, another student says, you're in line 20, you're a woman, Prince. But as we see here, everything is possible. The teacher concludes by saying, Sean knows that everything is possible, the princess Sean. And she goes on to ask, is Carl a princess? Are there other princesses in here beyond this part of the transcript? And the reason that I show you all this is because I have used TPRS personally with adult English language learners before. And I have found it to be, just as we stated in this article, I have found this to be very productive for example, related to troubling the content or to allow for expansive possibilities outside of the cis heteronormative status quo. So for me, this has been a tool to, again, to allow for difference to surface in the classroom. And now what I'm going to direct your attention to is a study that I conducted on Southeastern LGBTQ world language educators. And I'm going to show you a quote from a teacher who works in a conservative and cis heteronormative context. So he cannot speak about issues of gender and sexuality directly, but I'm going to show you what he did in his classroom. And in this up here, I have LGBTQ because this is how the 10 teachers in this study identified: lesbian, gay, bisexual, and queer. They self-identified in their survey. And so this quote here from John, a pseudonym, he talks about, again, he's in a context that he's not out. He also, again, has to be very careful of when and how he goes about discussing, for example, issues related to gender and sexuality. Again, he cannot directly state it, but as we see here, he used a story in his classroom from 19th century Spain, or a text or a story from his 19th century Spain. And again, he asked students to compare how would we look at this story today. Again, so making these comparisons and contrasts. This is something that we do in our classrooms all of the time as language educators, asking students to make comparisons and contrasts between their languages and cultures and, for example, our languages that we are teaching, right? Languages and cultures that we are teaching. And so here, again, asking students to make these comparisons and contrasts, especially if you are in a context, whether it's K through 12 or even or higher education context. Again, using these kind of materials to get students to interrogate the assumptions within the materials can be a way to invite that queer inquiry into your classroom. And so the last illustrative, example that I will show is from a recent study of LGBTQIA+ rural language educators in the southeastern US. And so I would like to show you this quote from Jack. And so Jack was describing how, for example, what he did in his conservative and cis heteronormative context with his students. And he described a creative approach for disrupting that cis heteronormative status quo. So he did a fashion show in his classroom. And as he says here, the cis male students are wearing skirts and being dramatic. And so again, creative approaches to language education can be ways to cultivate this a more critical language classroom, or to cultivate what Kubota and Miller said in 2017 as criticality. And so again, we have comparisons and contrast between the students' languages and cultures. And again, these are ways in which to destabilize cis heteronormativity, especially in contexts like Jack is working in which these types of issues cannot always be discussed due to the prevalence of state laws and also other aspects of his context. And so now bringing this all together, so thinking about queer theory and pedagogies, thinking about inclusionary approaches, gay and lesbian approaches, thinking about these studies that I have just discussed, I developed just a few different strategies for increasing the inclusion. And then after this, I will discuss how we can also invite more queer approaches in our classroom. So just some strategies here to begin with. So again, sharing yourself with your students as a gay man. For example, it depends on the context, right? That I may not always feel so welcome to share my identity. So this is something that I consistently think about in the context in which I am, for example, if I am speaking or whatever I am doing. But again, thinking about that, as educators, we want to build community in our classrooms. Community is central to my philosophy of teaching. So how much of you can share with your students is something to consider. Also, number two, reflect on these societal norms through self-awareness. So again, as I said earlier, talking about how norms produce exclusion for those relegated to the wrong side of the binary. Again, reflect on those societal norms, those discourses, and make sure that we are not reifying those in the classroom. Third, diversify class content. And again, have different authors of different races, ethnicities, sexual orientations, genders, disability, ability, etc., and beyond. So again, really drawing on those inclusionary approaches. Then the last 2 points, number 4, again, a short survey or an interest form to get to know your students. Again, I find community to be central to my teaching philosophy. And I strive to build community by getting to know my students. And so in every class that I've taught, I've always done a short interest survey or interest form at the beginning of our class on the first day to get to know them better and how I can incorporate their backgrounds into my practice. And then finally, here it is, community, community, community. I've been saying that throughout the past minute or two. And so again, including those experiences, thinking about these classroom activities that where students interact with one another, and then finally creating these types of rules. For example, in my classroom, on all of my syllabi, I always have what is called a positive classroom. So ensuring that's, and it's a little blurb about how I want to cultivate this in the classroom. I have also had my students help me revise that during the semester, because we may be engaging in discussions of aspects that, that could invite students, to say things that, for example, that, would be harmful or hurtful to others. So again, we create these types of agreements together to ensure that we are all being respectful of one another. So now let's move along to a kind of how can we maybe invite or some possibilities for queer inquiry or a queerer language education. And so I start with this quote here. Again, thinking about how we have to be mindful of stereotypes. And I start right here. Furthering the critical agenda requires closer examination of the ways in which small introductions to queer classroom content may unintentionally reify stereotypes or fall short of meaningful queer ambitions. And what I take out of this from Common Taylor et al. 22 is that, again, we have to be mindful of our practices in the classroom so that we do not reify the cis heteronormative status quo. And so now I'm going to provide 3 recommendations to maybe invite queerer inquiry into your classroom. So, and especially thinking about what I've been discussing, the type of context in which I currently reside, or in context where one cannot discuss, or any context in which one cannot discuss or is unable to discuss issues of gender and sexual diversity. And so to begin, reframe questions during classroom moments and instruction to upend students' normative assumptions and encourage them to consider how their assumptions are culturally and historically situated. So that means that we have to think critically about the questions that we are asking in our classrooms, as well as the questions that are being asked by our students. So how can we encourage, thinking about how can we encourage students to interrogate why they said what they said? And this is drawing on queer theories and pedagogies. So how that became normal for them to even think what they thought. And for example, in contexts in which educators might not be able to have representations of LGBTQIA plus individuals, this could be a possibility for conversations to eventually upend norms rather than reify norms. Number 2, integrate authentic materials that call cis heteronormativity into question. If you're using textbooks materials, interrogate those materials as well. So for example, when using textbooks or other publisher-oriented materials, how can you encourage that criticality as discussed by Kubota and Miller in 2017? So how can you bring a critical approach to the materials maybe that you are using in a textbook? And so I will not show this right now, but I want to leave you all with or describe an example, which was in my own classroom. I have used, for example, when I was teaching a listening speaking course over the past few years, I used one of my textbook video materials to discuss gender norms. And so this video was the speaker in the video made some very gendered statements about men or cisgender men and or about men and women is how it was stated in the video. And so again, I used what was said in that video, which stated women need trust and connection, men are competitive. So created this dichotomy and relied on these gendered assumptions. I used that as a moment, again, thinking about using classroom moments to interrogate what was said in the video. And again, to bring that critical approach to that material that was part of my classroom. And so my last recommendation is thinking about creative approaches to language teaching. So again, using, for example, drama, theater, teaching proficiency through reading and storytelling. Those can be ways in which you can bring different possibilities to the language classroom and potentially invite queer inquiry or queer theory and pedagogies into your classroom. And so finally, to finish, I wanted to talk about allyship. And so this here around allyship, or ally, as I have here. So I have 4 points around that. So first, with the A, aim to understand more about gender and sexuality. So again, recognize your own gaps in knowledge and experiences that might unintentionally lead to bias in the classroom. So we should recognize how language is a social construct. It evolves, or how, for example, how language evolves over time, that it's not static, that it's always becoming. And so again, thinking about those changes, making sure that making sure that our learners have access to the best ways to refer to themselves. And finally, with this aim to understand more about gender sexuality, another point within that is to think about how getting your students to compare and contrast how gender is treated differently in their languages and cultures, and how it is perceived in, for example, if you're in a US context, how is it perceived here? What are the assumptions around that? Second, listen carefully to your classroom discourse and look at your practices. So again, sometimes we can inadvertently reify cis heteronormativity in the classroom. Sometimes our pair work, our activities can lead to a less inclusive classroom. So we always have to critically examine our pedagogical choices. Third, L, so the next L, look for resources and examples that support critical queer pedagogy. So taking this back to what I said earlier regarding the prevalence of cis heteronormativity in our textbooks, curricular decisions, materials, research endeavors, and practices. Again, thinking about this, how language education can be what is Nelson described as a monosexual space in 2006. Again, we have to be aware that this is the language that we all swim in, this normal language that we all swim in. But we have to, again, invite that critical approach. And through this too, with resources and examples, tying this back to what I said previously about being inclusionary, thinking about, for example, single parent families, LGBTQIA plus parent families, families with racial and ethnic diversity, right? Making sure that we are being inclusionary. And then finally, you. So with this, again, everything begins with you, or with us, I should say, as an educator. And so we are powerful figures, and we are so impactful in our students' lives. And so we have the ability to shape our students' trajectories. So again, we have to be considerate of how we can be supportive of our LGBTQIA plus, as well as all students in our classrooms. And so that said, I want to thank you all, and I would like to open it up for questions. So what questions do you all have?
Okay, James. So just a couple of questions came up in the chat from Wallace Good. He's wondering if you can suggest any literature that would help us understand what is meant by anti-identity. And also, what do you mean when you say more than social? Oops, your volume,
Oh, I unmuted myself. Thank you, Melissa. So when I'm talking about, or when with anti-identity or literature related to that, or and so forth, I would suggest, for example, like, I mean, I could actually provide, well, if you email me, I can provide you an extensive list of resources, and I'll give you my email at the end. But I would say, for example, just looking at, I would say, Whedon 1987. Now, this is a post-structuralist approach, and that's what she takes to this. But again, post-structuralism influenced queer theory. And so that book was something that I read in my doc studies, and I really enjoyed it to understand more about these notions of fluidity in relation to identities. And then in the second question, and Melissa, can you remind me of that question, please?
yes. So that had to do about, you said more than social.
Oh, more than social. Okay. So so that's bringing in my also theoretical insights, thinking about the post-humanisms and new materialisms that are starting to shape, that have been shaping our field of language education as well. So not thinking, again, solely on this, on the human, but thinking about our thinking about everything in our more of, like I said, more than social world, considering everything.
Great. And Diane Larson Freeman is with us today. And the question that's been posed is, can you speak a little bit more about fluidity of identity?
Yes, that's an excellent question. Thank you. So thinking that identities are, so for example, identities are viewed as a, so from a post-structuralist or queer theory perspectives, right? Identities are viewed again as multiple, and I'm going to draw on Whedon 1987, multiple, contested, contradictory, right? And so that in contrast to these kind of prior theorizations of identities as a stable attribute of the humanistic self, this kind of cogito that was supposed to precede discourse, but actually is produced in and through discourse. This is again drawing a lot on my readings of post-structuralism and queer theory as well. But again, identities are not something that, they're something that we are, for example, co-constructing all of the time, right? In our interactions with individuals within this world. And so viewing identities, for example, thinking about, let's say, like sexuality, right? Sexuality is not something that's fixed, right? That, for example, individuals within their lives may be on a continuum of sexuality, right? That they may identify in one way at one point in their life, at other times in their lives, they may identify in different manners. And so, again, identity is, and I see this here coming about Bonnie Norton and Ron Darvin. Yes, Whedon's, they've definitely built on Whedon's conceptualization of identity for SLA. And so that is really important to recognize as well. But again, that identity is not something that's always fixed. It's something that it's always becoming. We are always becoming in this world. And I see some other questions here. Okay, so we have Diane. So Andy, queer inquiry and critical inquiry, and then we have a few questions. Okay, and then college. Melissa, would you prefer that I answer these questions, or should we take questions from the audience?
I think we can do both. I'll tell you, one that I'm definitely interested in is what advice can you give to countries such as those on the African continent that have laws against LGBTQ plus issues? And so professionally, it can be very dangerous to speak out openly about them. And so what are some ways to maybe work around that in the ESL, EFL classroom?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. What do you do when you can professionally face fear of reprisal related to speaking about those issues? So I always return to, for example, what I was stating earlier. So thinking about starting with our materials, right? If you really can't speak about issues of gender and sexuality in the classroom or LGBTQIA plus issues, what you can do is, again, interrogate the materials that you do have, but again, through the questioning practices. So what made this? So for example, if you have a picture, a photo, and of, let's say, and I'm thinking of Nelson 1999, of two women walking arm in arm, but I've also seen this happen in world language classrooms too, with individuals, and so, or with educators and what they have described. So again, let's say you have a picture of two women walking arm in arm in like a certain, or hand in hand, let's say, walking in a certain space or a certain context. You can ask students questions, again, around maybe their statements that they are uttering. So what if a student says, hey, oh, they're definitely lesbians, or that, to me, that would be lesbian, they would be lesbians, right? So getting students to say, well, to try to interrogate that. So what makes you say that? Why would you read this the ways in which you do? So I would start first of all with the materials and really interrogating. If you're using, let's say textbooks, like I was, like my example earlier around my own textbook, which I won't name here, that I used, but that textbook video, as well as the textbook, I wanted to interrogate those materials. But again, starting with those materials is a great way, and using those materials to kind of further critical conversations is something that I have done in contexts maybe that aren't always welcoming to those issues. So using what you have right there. I would also say, number two, attending to those classroom moments, right? So if a discussion just happens to arise, how can you use that classroom moment to, again, get students to think about why they're saying what they do? Because if they're making statements in the classroom, get them to try to ask them questions around why they are saying things the ways in which they are. How can you get them to see that it's historically and culturally produced, that these norms that they are uttering are subject to change and are becoming all of the time? So again, classroom materials and thinking about these conversations that may arise in the classroom can be two ways to start inviting this into your classroom. So thank you for that question.
James, I would also like to add that there's an intercultural communicative competence approach that language instructors can take to the classroom. And Josh Peiss's book, I think it's titled Queering the English Language Classroom, has some really practical approaches. So for Sean and any of the others who are interested in how you can incorporate those types of lessons or pieces of lessons into your classroom practice, even in societies where LGBTQI plus issues are against the law, as part of the language classrooms, we're trying to build that intercultural competence with our students. So providing them with the language and the tools and the understanding that LGBTQIA plus issues are very relevant and present in other countries around the globe is also an approach that folks can take.
Definitely. All right, so what other questions do we have?
So why don't we, if folks have questions or comments, you can unmute and put your video on and go ahead and ask those questions to us directly.
Good morning.
Hey, good morning.
Morning. I am here in Portland, Oregon, and I teach at a small liberal arts college where issues of LGBTQ plus are really part of the culture and the effort to express and acknowledge all identities. So I appreciate this. And I also appreciate the context of where you are teaching compared to where I am teaching. So for our situation here, I think what happens sometimes is a concern about representing other voices as a cisgender white woman and the challenges that can come with that in a classroom, not necessarily in a ESL international student-based classroom, although many of, I'm seeing a progression of kind of openness and understanding and curiosity about, and a choice of coming to Portland because of that acceptance. So can you speak to that idea of, representing in a certain way, or how to incorporate, materials from other perspectives without sounding like you're trying to say, I'm representing this by presenting it to you, if that makes sense.
Okay, so what I'm understanding out of this is you're asking, just, you're saying as a cisgender white woman and looking to include more representation of LGBTQIA plus individuals, right?
And all identities. I mean,
and
you
all
also,
identities
yeah.
too, right? And so how can you do that as a cisgender white woman, right? So in my experience doing this in my own classrooms, as a cisgender gay man, right, it has really just been creating my own materials. So I have had some situations or contexts that, for example, that I have worked in which I've had to use, for example, the textbook materials. But like I said previously, I would, interrogate the norms within those materials, right? And so thinking about, representation or including inclusionary perspectives, right? And how you can accomplish this, I would say, thinking about how you can do this without just not like as HEIS 2019 talked about in the JLIE article, right? Not like just a gay day or this day or that day. It should be something that is consistently done in your practice all of the time, right? So that you're not just posting a photo of let's say an LGBTQIA plus person to just say, okay, so today, check, I've done that, right? But really thinking meaningfully about, okay, so what are the objectives today? What are my students going to be able to do by the end of this lesson? And then selecting those materials, right? And then in those materials, looking at what you are selecting and saying, okay, so how can I ensure that I am having diverse representation of individuals as much as possible within this, that I'm not just showing a white person up here, that I'm not showing just a white gay upper class man in here or a couple or whatever. And so again, thinking intentionally about how you can incorporate, again, diverse representation within your practice every day. Because sometimes teachers may fall in, or educators may fall, even with the best intentions, again, may fall into the trap of, okay, well, I've done that and here it is, and I'm good. But again, just consistently ensuring that this is part of your practice all of the time, that you are seeking out those diverse representations within your materials.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Laura, for that question. I think we have time for one more question or comment.
Sounds great.
Well, good morning. I am from Costa Rica. Can you hear me?
I can. Good morning.
Okay, well, I think that this is more than a comment than a question. Here in Costa Rica, it is, it is not very common to talk about LGBTQ plus issues. It is not prohibited because we have a law and we are protected. But I teach a group that is formed just by women. And I would like to know, how could I raise awareness around those topics when you're working just with one gender in the class?
Okay. So what I'm understanding out of your question is, again, how can you raise awareness of LGBTQIA plus issues, right?
Yeah, right.
Okay. Yeah. And so first of all, Okay, so first of all, starting out, I would try to find some materials that you could pass along that are more practice oriented too, especially for your fellow colleagues. So I would find some, and I could even send you some materials too, if I'll put my email in the chat at the end. But again, using some materials that show some examples of how this will look or what this could potentially look like in their classroom can hopefully spur some ideas with your fellow colleagues. So that way you're saying, because what I'm understanding, again, you're just trying to raise awareness around this. So maybe, so not just in, excuse me, not just providing examples of what one can do in their practice, but also the why, right? So you're trying, in raising awareness, you have to give them the why of why this is important. And so I can send you something like that too after this. But again, giving them the why and then saying, so here's the why, here's why this is important. And then here's some strategies that others have done in their classrooms, right? In order to do this. I mean, you could go with HEIS's 2019 book. There are plethora of practical strategies for incorporating LGBTQIA plus issues in the classroom. And do we have time for one more question?
Well, we're with about 3 minutes
Okay.
left to go, James. So, so one thing I did want to mention is that the HEIS, the Higher Education Intersection, who has organized this event, and myself, along with my co-chair, we are now past co-chairs, Dini Gut. We are hoping to dedicate a newsletter to this topic. So for anyone who is interested in publishing your work and creating inclusive higher education classrooms, whether you're in an IEP or some other format, or even in your workplaces, how to make more inclusive workplaces in higher education, please send me your information, and I've included my email in the chat. But we'll also be following up with some more information on that on the higher education discussion board. So please look for that there. And with that, we must conclude today's online program. Today's presentation was titled Fostering Inclusivity and Challenging Norms in the Language Classroom. A special thank you to our presenter, James Coda. You did a magnificent job. Thank you so much. And this concludes the program. So you all can now disconnect. And thank you again.
I want to just say thank you all for being here today. It was great to be here with all of you. And thank you for the wonderful questions. I left my email in the chat. So if you have a second and you have a question, please feel free to reach out to me, and I will respond as soon as possible.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thanks all. And thanks, Melissa, for this.